Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us again this week. I'm here with Pastor Nick Cady, who is the pastor of Whitefields Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado, and we are currently in our series Pilgrim's Progress as we study through Peter's letters, 1st and 2nd Peter. Peter's letters there to the Christians in the greater Roman Empire during that time, and we've come to the end of 1st Peter. We're in chapter 5. We looked at chapter 5 on Sunday. This is a rich chapter to get into, and just a lot of amazing things and a lot of great verses to just sit on. And one of the things I even talked about, God of all grace, was just a great phrase that was one of those things that kind of life-changing in my just opened my mind to God of who God is and just delving into his character. But one of the verses that you looked at was just this idea: be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion. And one of the interesting facts you brought up is that people seem to be under the impression, that there's this tug of war going on between God and the devil, and there's our adversary. There's this, yin and yang. There's this evil and good. Kind of the idea of Star Wars. Darth Vader and the Force and all this kind of stuff. And that one day we just hope that God's going to win out. And and of course you cleared that up, that there is absolutely no way that that Satan is in any way God's equal in any form whatsoever. But there were some things that that we discussed later on that you weren't able to include in your sermon because, of course, there was so much in here, but that you wanted to expand on that theme just a little bit more.
Yeah, so Peter says that, he's a roaring lion, etc. But I always love what Paul says in Colossians chapter 2 on this subject. And it doesn't just have to do with evil spirits, but it also does at the end. So I'll just go there, Colossians chapter 2. And here's what he says. He talks about what Jesus accomplished on the cross. And he uses a series of metaphors. Like he talks about baptism. So he talks about, how we have died and been resurrected with Christ. And then he says this: you were dead in your trespasses. God made you alive. Then he goes on to say, he canceled the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. So he uses the metaphor of, legalities, right? A record, a list of things you've done wrong. And he says they were nailed to the cross with Christ. And such a good picture. But then he says this: he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them. And that idea of open shame is something which ancient readers would have been familiar with, especially those in the Roman Empire, like where Colossae was, but also the people Peter was writing to, and even outside the Roman Empire. But it was particularly a practice in ancient world, Alexander the Great and, the Persian armies, and you look at the Roman Empire, what they would do is that when they would have a battle, let's say Rome went to war with Persia at one point, for example, and they would have a battle and they would defeat an army. Well, what they would do, or let's say the Germanic tribes, the hordes coming from the north, the empire, they would be attacked or they would take new ground. And when they defeated an army, what they would do is they would put them to open shame. And what that would mean is that they would give them a fate which arguably was worse than death. They would tie them up, they would chain them, and then they would lead them in a procession. They would march them all the way back to Rome. You can imagine all the roads, they go through towns, right? So you go through every single town, people come out of their houses and they see the victorious army, and in their train, they're leading in chains and ropes and tied up, sometimes probably naked, this defeated, and not just defeated, but humiliated army and soldiers. And so people would throw things at them, they would mock them, and finally the peak of their humiliation, they would come into Rome, and not only would they have a parade down the great boulevards in Rome where people would see them, mock them, etc., but then they would be sold as slaves. And so that would be the ultimate humiliation. And you could say that in these people's minds, that would be a fate worse than death, that your enemy not only defeated you, not only did you lose the battle, but your entire life and existence now becomes to serve as a slave the very people who you were fighting against. And Paul says that is what God has done in Christ to the devil, Satan, and the evil powers out there, so demonic forces. So in no way is it yin and yang, right? The devil is not the counterpart of God. Sometimes I think it's so ridiculous the way that people give the devil way too much credit. Mm-hmm. I mean, he has been disarmed and put to public humiliation. Now, it's interesting because he hasn't been destroyed. yet. We know from Revelation that there will come a time when after the day of judgment, the devil and hell will be cast into the lake of fire, which is called the second judgment. So that will happen, but for now, he's still allowed. Now you might wonder, why would God still allow the devil, if he's been defeated, to not be destroyed? For very good reasons, which we've talked about over the past couple of weeks in 1 Peter precisely, which is that God actually uses the devil to accomplish some of his things that he does, right? So the devil can't touch you without permission, right? So we see that in the book of Job. The devil wants to touch Job, and God says, okay, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do. He puts limitations on what he can do, and he has to get permission. That's why we said yesterday, in some ways, we're a greater danger to ourselves than the devil is to us, because he has to get permission to touch us and wreck our lives. Well, we don't need anybody's permission to go and do something that will wreck our lives. So how this would work then is that what is the ultimate humiliation, right? Being made a slave, according to this metaphor that Paul uses, being put to public shame. Well, what it would be is not only has he, bound him, so to say, right? He can only do what God permits him to do. But the ultimate shame, if you're the devil, is that everything that you are allowed to do ultimately backfires on you and accomplishes fulfilling God's great purposes and goals, right? Whether it's for believers or for unbelievers. We looked at, last week, we looked at 6 things that God does in his loving kindness through suffering that are good. And so that's the ultimate humiliation, is that everything that you're allowed to do ultimately works against you. It accomplishes the opposite of what you hoped it would. And so I think that is the way that we need to walk as Christians in victory, that in Christ we are more than conquerors, more than victors. He has been disarmed, disabled, and anything that comes into my life, there are still bad things that happen, and yet God is using those not only for my good now, but to build up a weight of glory to be revealed in the future.
Yeah, no, that's a great thought, and I think it's very important for us to make sure we keep that in perspective, that Satan is in no way God's counterpart, and as you said, we give him way too much credit. So if you were not able to hear Sunday's message, hey, get over there, whitefieldschurch.com, and you can download it. And we'll be continuing through 2 Peter after we take a break for Advent series and Christmas. But we'll still be here every week doing these videos. And just to leave you with there's a great verse there, just to leave you with this verse is kind of the oldest pun, probably one of the oldest puns in the Bible. Cast your cares on him, for he cares for you. And I like the way you put it on Sunday, the idea of casting. We're not handing God our cares. We're not laying them down to be able to pick them up, but we're casting. We're just throwing them. Throw them on Jesus. For that thought, for this week, I think that's a great thought. Just if there are things that you're dealing with, these things that Satan is anxieties that you're fighting with, cast them. It's a way we just kind of physically just cast them on the Lord, and because He cares for you. Cast your cares on him, for he cares for you. So on that thought, Spotify, we're there, Apple Play, Google Play, whatever plays, we're everywhere. On YouTube, like, subscribe, comment, any of those things, any of these platforms. It really helps to get our content out to a broader audience. And so we look forward to again seeing you next week. God bless.